Welcome back everybody, and this video is about sparsity. One important variable in population codes is sparsity, the proportion of neurons that will fire in a given time window. And that's also related, of course, to the proportion of stimuli to which a given neuron will fire, or to the proportion of neurons that fire to a given stimulus, and to the breadth of tuning. So each neuron can participate in principle in the representation of many different stimuli or concepts, and each concept can be represented by multiple neurons. And the question that we have is, how many neurons are involved? You can think of this as a kind of continuum. So at one end of the continuum, every neuron is involved in the representation of every concept or stimulus, and so every neuron is firing to some extent, to some degree, at any point in time. Or at the other end of the spectrum, only one neuron is involved in the representation of a particular stimulus or concept, and so only one neuron will be firing at a time. So while the idea of a single neuron being involved in the representation of a given concept is probably rather extreme, it's a grandmother cell, and we don't think they exist, and they'd be very hard to find if they did exist. But we do know that very sparse representations exist. So we have some brain systems where very few of the neurons are firing at any one time, and those neurons fire very selectively to specific stimuli. So that would be a very sparse representation, and we do see some of them in the brain. For example, the Jennifer Aniston cells that we discussed in a previous lecture respond quite selectively to images of Jennifer Aniston, but they don't respond to other people. So that's a sparse distributed representation on the one hand, and on the other end of the spectrum we've got very densely distributed representations where a high proportion of the cells are firing to some extent at all times. So an example might be something like the V1 cells. We know that there are lots of different orientations represented in area V1, and everywhere we look there are orientated edges around in the visual field, and those cells also have fairly broad tuning, so quite a number of the cells will be firing to some extent everywhere we look at all times. So population codes allow a degree of flexibility in terms of the sparsity of the representation, and we can ask ourselves whether different types of representation, whether sparse representations or dense representations, have different advantages and disadvantages, and that's what I'd like to think about a little more in this video. So to try to keep this explanation fairly straightforward, I'm actually going to talk about this more extreme version of sparse representation, a grandmother cell-like code. And of course, we know that's not entirely realistic, but most of the same arguments are going to apply to more realistic forms of representation. So let's imagine we're going to use a grandmother type code to represent the identities of some celebrities. So we've got, let's say, like the color code that we discussed before in a previous video, we've got 3 neurons. How many identities can we represent? Well, in a very sparse grandmother-like code, we would not be able to represent very many identities. We've used one of our neurons as a Rupert Grint detector, and the next neuron is a Serena Williams detector, the next neuron is a Ed Sheeran detector, and now we've run out of neurons, so we can only represent 3 people with the 3 neurons, 1 neuron per person. So if we wanted to represent, say, Jennifer Aniston or Venus Williams, we're going to need an additional neuron. So we can contrast that with the situation that would apply in a more densely distributed code where more of the neurons are firing to each stimulus. So as we saw with the color code in the previous video, with just 3 different neurons we can encode quite a rich variety of different experiences. So we can easily come up with 5 distinct patterns for our 5 different celebrities, and in fact we could probably represent many more different people with these different patterns. So what are the advantages and the disadvantages of those different types of coding? Well, in the grandmother code we obviously will need more neurons to represent the same number of people, but the advantage of it might be that each neuron has a unique representation. There's absolutely no neural firing in common between, say, Rupert Grint and Ed Sheeran. So there's no sense in terms of your neural code that you might get those 2 people mixed up. Whereas if we look at the more densely distributed code, some of the neurons that fire to Rupert Grint are going to be shared with the neurons that fire to Ed Sheeran, and perhaps the patterns of activity are more similar to one another, and it might be harder to tell those people apart in terms of the neural code. So that might have some advantages but also some disadvantages. The overlap between those two representations might make it easier to generate similar responses to the two different people, and in some circumstances that's going to be appropriate. But in other circumstances we might need to generate a unique response to each unique person, in which case the overlap between the two representations is going to hamper that response. The more extreme sparse representation here makes it harder to generalize across stimuli because there's no overlap between the neural patterns that each individual evokes. But that could be useful in some circumstances, for example when we need to distinguish different individuals and make unique responses to each person. And similarly, there might be some advantages for long-term memory because patterns that involve the same active neurons are going to tend to interfere with one another, and that means that in models of memory we find that capacity is limited by the overlap between the patterns that have to be stored. When there's less overlap, more patterns can be stored. And we can also think about which type of representation is more efficient. So if we think about a very sparse representation, we're going to need more neurons to represent the same number of distinct stimuli or concepts. So that will take up more space inside the head, and perhaps that's a limited resource. And each cell will of course require some material to build it and to maintain its health. But on the other hand, in a sparse representation, each cell will be firing less often, so it might be using less energy in that sense. So it could be more efficient in terms of the energy that it uses, but perhaps less efficient in terms of the space and resources it requires. So on this slide I'm trying to summarize what the advantages and disadvantages of the different forms of representation are in this more realistic situation where we've got potentially a continuum between very sparse representations at one end of the spectrum and very dense representations at the other end of the spectrum. The brain doesn't necessarily have to choose one of these forms of representation. We've already seen, in fact, that some parts of the brain employ very sparse representations, whereas other parts of the brain seem to employ very dense representations. And all of those possibilities are available, and what's happening is that systems have evolved to use the form of representation that's most important or most useful for the function that they have to fulfill. At the top of the slide, the graph indicates the expected relationship between the number of neurons we have available in the population on the x-axis, and on the y-axis the number of distinct patterns that we can encode. So in a very sparse representation, increasing the number of neurons leads only to a very gradual increase in the number of patterns that are available to be encoded, whereas in a very dense distribution, a small increase in the number of neurons produces a much larger increase in the number of patterns that we can encode. In a very sparse representation, each neuron is highly selective, whereas in a very dense representation, each neuron can have a very broad tuning and will respond to most stimuli. And that means that very sparse representations tend to emphasize the uniqueness of the concept or stimulus, whereas very dense representations capture the similarity between stimuli and emphasize generalization. A sparse representation hinges on the activity of just a few neurons, so each neuron is playing a vital role in that representation, so it might be more vulnerable to damage than a dense representation in which a very large number of neurons contribute. From the perspective of learning and memory, there may be some advantages for very sparse representations in that the lack of overlap between patterns makes them more resistant to interference, and it also allows for more rapid learning and for simpler network architectures. The number of neurons involved in dense representations and the overlap between patterns can make it harder to learn. It can take longer and require more complex neural network architectures in order to learn to do something different in the face of a similar pattern of neural activation. So to summarise, although grandmother cells have not been found in the brain and they seem rather unlikely on theoretical grounds, very sparse representations do exist. And in fact we see something like a continuum between very sparse representations and dense representations, and each type of representation may have its own advantages and disadvantages in the context of different functions. But in sparse representations, a small proportion of neurons carry information about a given stimulus or event.